Welcome to our talk, Baroque and Renaissance Influences in Video Games. My name is John Robert Metz, and let's kind of introduce ourselves a little bit here. Let's start immediately to my left.
All right, so my name is Ana Lilia Fierro, and I'm actually a local music performer and educator in the Baltimore area. Just a little quick information about me. So I got my bachelor's in keyboard performance at Towson University, but I also played a bunch of other Baroque instruments. I played the harpsichord, I studied forte piano, and I also played the organ. I've attended like a few Baroque workshops, including the one at Oberlin, and there's another one all the way in San Francisco where I basically studied basso continuo. We'll probably explain that if we have time. It's basically just accompanying people. That's really what it is. And yeah, pass it on to you.
Oh boy, I'm not ready. This is my first time at this convention, and is it Greg? Sorry.
It's me.
Yeah.
Okay, it's me. Awesome.
I'm already
Okay, so my name is Gregory Orris. You may or may not know me as Gamer of the Winds. I do covers on YouTube. I'm also a local artist in the area. I studied flute at CCBC for my associate's degree, where I had a heavy focus on Baroque music and Baroque performance. And currently I am attending Towson University, where I am studying clarinet, and I'm on to my final semester, next semester, to get my bachelor's. Yes. Thank you.
Hi. Oh yeah, we got the organetto. I meant to have this later in the thing, but that's a medieval handheld organ that I'm working on making a set of these things. But as music performance, I was classically trained under Julie Hickox, who was under Laurie Sokoloff and James Galway, and then dabbled into the English horn. And really, my first instrument was the tin whistle, which is like a little tiny Irish flute. It's very similar to the recorder. But I decided to become an organ builder as my main profession, and I did like a 10-year journeyman apprenticeship under some really good organ builders, and we won't say anything about the other ones. So I ended up settling here in the DC area, and now I'm opening up business for my new company, Harbor Pipe Organs, based out of Baltimore in the DC area. So that's about it.
And I am John Robert Metz. I'm a composer, an arranger, and I have done a fair bit of work in video games. Pardon me here, I'm realizing that Slack is open in the background, which is going to just give you that wonderful for every 5 seconds, the one that makes you really neurotic after a while. So, but yes, my name is John Robert Metz. I'm a composer. I write arrangements from time to time. I am an educator. I am also a performer specializing specifically in brass and vocal music. You may have seen me playing with the game brass here this weekend, up on stage with David Wise back on Thursday, and doing a whole lot of random other things. But tonight, we're here to talk to you about historical music, specifically music of the Renaissance and Baroque, and its influence on video game music and the video game scores that we know and love. And to kind of begin this exercise, we need to kind of set a bit of a background. So we're going to look at music throughout history, starting off with kind of the earliest known music, what we call prehistoric music. And there are a few different terms for this, but we're going to go with prehistoric. Sometimes people call it like pre-ancient or things like that, but we don't know a ton about it. This is music from people that didn't have modes of writing yet, so we don't have a lot of records. We have found some interesting things like bone flutes, things that look like they could have been like primitive drums, or logs that were hollowed out to be struck, things of that sort. We imagine that there must have been some vocal aspect because humans like to sing, they like to speak, and so probably, perhaps some chanting or something to that effect, or actual tones, but we have nothing really to go on.
Oh, John, I wanted to add something.
Yeah, sure.
I just skipped over. There was a recent, it's kind of an idea that a lot of the caves that have cave drawings, which you're seeing right there in Europe, they were like, well, there are all these other bigger caves with better walls for art, but they've discovered that most of the caves that have drawings have excellent acoustics, so it's pretty much assumed that music was part of some sort of, unknown things in the past, you can infer
It's
that.
quite possible that that is
Yeah.
the case. Unfortunately, we can't be absolutely sure,
Yep.
but it is quite possible. That moves us into what we call ancient music, which is kind of a catch-all term for a massive period of history, basically from 2500 BC to 400 AD, and this covers everything from ancient Egyptian music to the Mesopotamian era and the Greek and the Romans, which with some of the civilizations that we have the best recorded records of what music might have been like. The Greeks give us some instruments like the guitar, which are basically lutes, like you see this man here playing at the top. The aulos, which is like a flute instrument, a fipple flute that you would blow through. Sometimes there were two barrels, so you could play two different notes at the same time. Drums, the hydraulis, voices, etc. People would sing, and we start to begin to see the beginnings of music notation. We can't be absolutely sure what this stuff sounded like or what the tunes were, but there was definitely text and notational elements, probably pitches and rhythm, and a lot of stuff was just inferred. It would be like handing someone a lead sheet today, and, oh, you know this tune, of course. You can work from this. Here are the chords. It's maybe not enough to go from if you haven't heard the tune, but it was definitely some early types of notation. Moving forward to medieval music, this is where things start to get interesting.
All right, so the medieval era is pretty much from 476 AD to 1453, and this is the era where you start seeing Gregorian chants, and these are basically liturgical music used in religious worship, mainly the Catholic Church. And you also maybe start seeing a bit of a sign of polyphony. We're going to introduce those terms very soon, but for medieval music, it's just called an organ, where you just have two voices together. But we also have some instruments, including like the dulcimer, the lyra, the recorder, lute, and the portative organ. And if you see those pictures up there, they come from the Cantigas de Santa Maria, which is basically a collection of pictures of the medieval era. So if you ever want to look for some primary sources of pictures from the medieval era, look at the Cantigas de Santa Maria. You can move on. All right, so you want to talk about that?
Sure.
Fine.
So what you have in the medieval period is, as mentioned a second ago, two different kinds of things developing. First, there's what we call monophony, and which basically means you have a single musical voice, versus polyphony, which is multiple musical voices. And something that you may have heard, who here has heard the term Gregorian chant? Okay, good. So Gregorian chant became very, very popular weirdly in the 90s. I don't know why, but Gregorian chant is basically a type of liturgical music that was developed by the Catholic Church for masses and high holy days, for prayers to be sung. And the reason you sang these things was because your voice carries much better when you're singing versus speaking. And you would sing these prayers. And they had specific, carefully defined notes, and they were written out eventually in staff form, etc. And it was just a one unison line, and a solo singer, a cantor, would sing, or a group of singers would sing in unison one line. Moving a little bit further in history, that got a bit boring. And so we started to develop something in church music called polyphony. All right, so going from one musical line to multiple musical lines. And in just general music terms, the term polyphony just means multiple things happening rather independent of each other. Almost like you're writing multiple melodies that sound good together, rather than ones that clash or that are like a unified melody with a harmony underneath. Now, in historical examples, this is a good one. So this is from a Gregorian Mass. This is the Dies Irae, which is the Mass for the Dead. Mm-hmm. You may have heard this tune before. It is something that has been excerpted out and used in a million things, including video games. But what you'll see here is a little bit of the early sort of 4-line staff script that you would see in this, and some early music notation. Now, there's a little bit of rhythmic notation going on here. We don't want to express anything right now, sorry. But we have a little bit of music notation, rhythmic notation, pitches defined, and text belowhand. All right. Notice that we have a single musical line and a group of singers singing it. Now, if we move a little bit further on, we can see how that kind of idea from the early church music, can kind of bleed over into the video game world a little bit. Single voice in this case, but a single vocal line that has a very simple melody, no accompaniment, no additional lines. We could let that go for quite a while until you finally, I think, save your game.
Yeah,
Anyway.
the next one is actually a more famous example of a music that was influenced by a Gregorian chants.
You can give me just a second. I'm apparently popular and I missed something. There it is. Gone. Too many things. Apologies, guys. So, again, traditionally, most church music, especially from this early period, was sung by male voices, priests or friars, brothers, etc., people in the clergy, and so this adheres a little bit more to that even, is a group of singers. So, moving on a little bit, we talked about the idea of polyphony. Now, polyphony, in this case, this is some very early stuff. This is from the Mass of Notre Dame by Guillaume de Machaut, who's a very famous early composer, and he's writing basically in two-part organum here. The top voice is something that we have heard before, or, well, actually we haven't heard it before in this case, but it is a straightforward traditional Gregorian chant melody. It never gets changed, but it gets stretched out in some interesting ways, and then he writes another part around that. And so what you're going to hear here is two voices intertwined, or two vocal parts intertwined. Notice how they kind of move together, but they're almost like independent melodies. You can't say, that's the melody and that's the accompaniment. They're very equally tethered, equally yoked, if you will. And we'll stop there, because they don't really breathe ever.
It's called circular breathing.
Circular breathing, yes. Now, you get some of that influencing, again, coming back.
Oh yeah, just a disclaimer, there's going to be a lot of Castlevania stuff. Yeah. Polyphonic music, sorry. So, that takes us through the medieval period. We've set a lot of the groundwork for what is going to become suddenly an explosion of musical variety and color and interesting new ideas. And that takes us into what is known as the Renaissance. All right, so a little bit of history lesson for you guys. So during the Renaissance, it's from the 1300 to 1600, and now this is known as the Rebirth era. This is like right after the bubonic plague. Anyone familiar like what happened during that period?
It's a fun time.
A lot of people died, and because a lot of people died, there weren't as much competition for food. Now people had more. They didn't have to work as hard. They don't have to worry about food as much. So we have like all these like famous artists and musicians like Michelangelo. You know, does anyone know Michelangelo? Oh yeah, I'm familiar. Shakespeare, Da Vinci. This one I don't expect anyone to know. Anyone know Monteverdi? Yes. Oh wow, I'm impressed. Yeah, he's basically a famous Renaissance composer. So during this time, this is actually where you come with the term like the Renaissance man, basically someone who can do anything, and that's because these people had a lot of free time to do all this stuff. So after bubonic plague, it's like you have so much free time at this point. So yeah, seriously. So, and then we head into the Baroque era, which is from the 1600 to 1750, and this is also known as the Reformation / Counter-Reformation. This is basically happened like right after what we call the Great Schism, when the Catholic Church kind of it kind of decided to split. Well, not just that, actually.
And some people in the Catholic Church decided to split from
Yeah.
the Catholic Church. So, you know, Martin Luther nailing his thoughts and opinions up, that sort of thing. So fun and excitement. But that actually then results in some very different musical ideas being introduced. And as the Lutheran Church forms and the Calvinists begin to do other things, the musical ideas begin to kind of percolate and branch off in different ways. And eventually there's cross-pollination, but at first it's still very isolated. But you get composers like...
Yeah, we get composers like Bach, Vivaldi, Handel, and the other guy is actually an artist, Caravaggio. If I don't know if anyone took like art history, he definitely would be mentioned in Baroque art. All right, and of course we have some pictures here. We have a badly cropped Mona Lisa right up there.
The Louvre wouldn't let us show the whole thing.
Yeah.
You have to go there to see the whole thing.
Yeah, and we have, of course, really Shakespeare, also all from the Renaissance era, and that's actually one of the... And we have some instruments there, some Renaissance instrument right there. All right, we can move on.
It's a viol and a lute, right?
Violin and a lute, yeah.
Which we'll talk about right now.
I'm gonna briefly, because I have my photos later.
Oh, it's fine.
Yeah. So these are just a list of some Renaissance instruments. We got the recorders, which everybody maybe regretfully remembers from elementary school. The pipe organ, the organetto, that instrument's been around since Greek times, and it keeps changing. The harp, the viol, the hurdy-gurdy, which is the great thing. The schwam, a predecessor to the oboe, and some brass would be the cornet, the sackbut, trumpet, and serpent. The lute, the harpsichord, the clavicitherium, did I get that right?
Sounds about right.
Yeah, the crumhorn, which is kind of like a bagpipe without the bag, and
It's
a
an
kettle drum,
encapsulated double reed instrument, basically.
yeah, which a lot of organ pipe reeds are too, and then all of them, and then the kettle drum, which is the predecessor, or another name for the timpani. So
moving into these,
Whoa.
we have...
is this my?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm
Oh,
just
okay.
setting you up.
Pictures.
So I'm just going on from here.
Yeah, go for
Okay.
it. So we have, we've already kind of talked about this, right? So you don't have anything to say
You
about
didn't.
pictures
did-
of these things, right?
Right. Okay. You didn't mark the C.
Oh.
This is why we say a long time no see.
So we have here the shawms, which are your early predecessors to the oboe. The crumhorn, which we said was an encapsulated double reed instrument, so it's like a bagpipe. You force air in through the cap at the one end, and two reeds vibrate against each other to produce tone, and you finger over the holes, much like your classic elementary school recorder.
You got it. Where's the recorder? Right there.
Well, I mean, I can see this.
Yeah.
Fine. Okay. Yeah, the Chalamu, and
Chalamu.
I spelled that earlier correctly, but it's misspelled up there. And the bombard, which is like a French reed, and you have one.
Would you like to demonstrate,
fantastic.
please?
Yeah, could you?
My God.
This is.
Please bombard us.
This is. Is it ready to play?
Audience participation encouraged.
It's really, this is really loud, and it comes later on about my spiel about the organ, because this is just like the recorder, the bombard, all these instruments, you can have a sopranino all the way down to a double bass. So
Speaking of like sopranino, so you can have very small recorders, that are like. which is very nice and makes some people cover their ears, which is
Yeah.
fair. All the way down, like this is not even as big as anything. You wanna demonstrate real quick, Greg?
Oh, yes. And here I have an alto. Believe it or not, yes, this big thing is an alto. And most of you probably have played soprano recorders in school. So.
And of course, we have even bigger ones, your tenor and your bass and your contrabass, but we'll take a look at those in a bit.
Yeah. And then here's some brass, the cornet, which is, I'm pretty sure, very similar to the trumpet in sound, and the serpent, which I just love because, this other image, because I'm thinking, oh, it'd be so great if somebody could make one like one of the Final Fantasy summons, Leviathan. I think that'd be really cool.
The interesting thing about, the interesting thing about your serpents and your early brass instruments as a brass fan is things like this. You have the serpent, you have the cornet, you also have things like the sackbut, which is the best name in the world. But your serpent and your cornets are made of wood. And the mouthpieces are usually made, if they're made of metal, it's amazing, but usually they're like made of ivory or also carved wood.
Yeah.
The cornet is basically a recorder with a wooden trumpet mouthpiece or an ivy trumpet mouthpiece wedged in the end, and it plays remarkably. It was very, very popular because it was described as being the closest thing to the human voice that you could have at this point. It was a wonderful solo instrument, a very, very flexible instrument as a result. The serpent, on the other hand, fills in the lower bass end. And you see how it has all these curves here. That's because at the time, we didn't have like the valve systems we have today. Instead, you have keys that cover holes. And when the holes are open, there's more venting of air. And because guess what? If you have to cover holes over the length of an entire instrument that's 16 feet long, you got to do something. So they curl it, and then it becomes the serpent.
Okay, okay, before we get there, so the ocarina shows up in the Renaissance too. So here's the version. It's called the Gims horn, which is also a pipe organ stop. It's basically an ocarina made out of a goat's horn, and this was like the first one I made, so it really just sounds terrible. I'm not going to demonstrate it. And then the panpipe actually was a Renaissance instrument, usually called the frestel, and then a syrinx. And so I have a little one that I made, and you all can direct message me on my Facebook page if you want to buy one. So this is, I kind of took this out of the automated pipe organs, and sometime really late at night I had this idea that if I just lined the holes up, it would play a tune from the Zelda games. So you don't even know how to play the instrument, you just go left to right and it'll do it. So, and the hurdy-gurdy, I love this thing. So there's a little wheel crank you'll see as it plays, and this goes with the medieval music, and the organ's playing alongside on this piece. We're gonna play like a little clip, but, whoops. There's the drone bass, and then the melody above it, and it's a really good acoustic. This could be walking around in the Castlevania castle. No, that's fine. And you can't really hear it, but there's a lot of like the action out of all these early instruments. You can hear them, and that adds a lot to the music. Actually, a lot of times we don't want to hear these noises, but I think in the old instruments they really add some things. We can sing.
Interesting thing about the hurdy-gurdy is if you look here, this is a wheel basically, and it's basically using the same, functioning the same as a bow on a traditional bowed instrument. And as he spins the wheel, which is rosin, it's rubbing against the strings. And it's a very, very complicated mechanism. There are several strings that are just there to vibrate in sympathy along with the sound, along with the wheel. And so as these strings vibrate, these little ones here on the side, they just kind of buzz and add this kind of shimmer in the air above it. Yeah. And you can turn those on and off by unstringing them or restringing them. And then all of these buttons stop the strings. It's like an automatic fretboard that you would be able to press to stop the string at a certain note.
Yeah, there's like one or two strings usually that's kind of like a chanter on a bagpipe that plays the melody, and the rest of them are drone pipes.
And some of them,
what am I saying? Pipes. I'm always relating things to pipe organs.
But,
Drone
well,
strings. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And two, like I suppose all of them did have sympathetic strings.
Yeah,
which is something we've lost in modern instruments. There's
like this is specifically extra strings on the side here, which I don't know if you can actually hear in the recording, but they are vibrating completely, you can't adjust them or
Yeah.
anything like that. You can tune them so that they vibrate with the tune that you're playing, but
And here it is in the viola d'amore, the lovely viola, right? Those lower, like if you've seen any cello or violin, double bass in an orchestra, they don't have those little sets of extra strings below there. So, and a lot of these instruments from back then are a lot brighter than what we have. They're a lot of darker sounds. So that's kind of going into what I'm saying. And there's another lute. And we can go on to the
which
next.
is just basically your predecessor to the guitar, but with a
Yeah.
lot more strings and takes a
Yeah.
lot longer to tune.
Probably breaks easy too. The tabor, which is the predecessor to the snare drum, I believe, and it took some time, centuries, to get there.
Yeah,
And-
it's basically like a tom, more like a tom, but then they start to add things to it that'll buzz and vibrate, and that
Yeah.
begins to be similar to what you have with snare drums.
And there's a lot of percussion left out here. I think people travel around just ringing bells and castanets and things, and the kettle drum here is the predecessor
Tambourines
to
and
the
so on.
timpanate. Yeah, because a lot of the traveling musicians back then, and we're trying to emulate these kinds of environments in video games. And, yeah.
So this takes us back to, as we promised, some very exciting recorders here. So this is a recorder consort performing the Earl of Essex Galliard. This is the Royal Wind music. This is written by John Dowland, who was a contemporary, I believe, of like Shakespeare, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, and so you see here, basically in this ensemble of recorder players, a variety of different recorders in play, from the like huge contrabass recorder that has to sit on the floor, and has a tiny, and this is so small, let's see if we can get full screen, a tiny little vocal, which is what we call piping that comes out of the top of like a wind instrument, like a bassoon or something like that, that comes off the top all the way down so that she can play it down here and put the air through the top and then down the entire instrument. These start to introduce the use of keys as well to extend the finger range of a player so that they can reach notes that are actually opened and closed all the way over the length of an instrument that is impossibly big.
So believe it or not, the bass recorder is actually a lot easier to play for people with smaller hands than a tenor, because a tenor recorder actually does not have any keys, and it's a pretty big stretch to go. But I remember when I first bought my bass recorder, man, you got those keys, so it's really a lot easier to play.
So when you see this sort of thing, it's very nice. It is a lot of little moving parts, multiple voices. Almost no one is playing the exact same part. And there's some imitative counterpoint and things of that sort. Yes, sir.
Okay, so the third in from the right, that person's had their foot like beveled the entire time. Is that like supporting the instrument?
This person here?
Yes.
I
I think you're right. Yeah, because the other one's going to stand, the bass, the sub bass.
it almost looks like they're sitting on a stool or something like that, aren't they? And it's kind of behind his leg, and so he's kind of like up off the ground a little bit. He might be resting the heel of the bell of the instrument on his heel.
Yeah.
Telekinesis.
Yeah. Or he's just floating. It could be he's levitating. He's cast flight. That's probably the case. All right, let's see if I can get out of this. Yes, it didn't crash. Good. It just, let's see here. Full screen again.
Oh, yeah.
Full screen, I say.
Yeah, so
Please
this
go full
music
screen.
basically borrows the idea of a recorder consort, which is basically just another word for ensemble.
Hang on a second. I'm going to hit present again. So it goes
Okay,
back to full
there you
screen
go.
successfully. A tune that we probably know, but very much the same recorder consort idea. Very much planting the setting of Final Fantasy IX in a world that is very much influenced by that Renaissance era. A fanciful one. I mean, you have airships, but the airships that they could have been designed by an alternate universe Da Vinci, you know. And so this kind of plants us in that universe very nicely. It's lovely, even if it isn't live instruments. It's doing the job very nicely. That takes us a little bit further into Renaissance era vocal music. This is the era of madrigals. Who here has ever like sung in a choir and like knows that term? Fantastic. Okay, so madrigals are polyphonic, multiple voices. They introduce or at least use an element that we call homophony. Wow, words. We usually just say, you know, it's homophonic writing or polyphonic writing. pretty much to describe whether or not it's multiple independent voices doing things by themselves, or multiple melodies happening at the same time, or more like a melody and an accompaniment, or like a whole thing that is like stacked in chords or things like that. But basically, a madrigal was a song. Usually it's almost always a secular subject. They tend to be funny. They tend to deal with love. They tend to deal with passion and excitement, the thrill of youth, the depression of love lost. There's a lot of tragedy. There's a lot of joy, etc. They sometimes are really funny. They like to throw in little nonverbal like divergences like fa la 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 la, la, etc. And you get stuff like this.
Now is the month of May,
which is very soft.
of May, fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Now is the month
So
of May.
this is multiple voices that are all very much doing something together, but sometimes
Each with his body
every now and again, just by the instruments. One of my favorite groups, the King Singers here.
each with his body last upon the green
Ideas. It's a secular subject. We'll stop there. But now, this kind of stuff, does this show up in video games? I think yes. This game came out this year. Let's see if this actually works. I have my notes here. Wonderful. This is a game called Astrologaster, which is absolutely wonderful. I said this year, didn't I? I guess we're not in this year anymore. This came out last year. In 2019, the distant past. And it's absolutely wonderful, where you play as a doctor attempting to cure people in London in the era of Shakespeare, in the age of Shakespeare, except you do it by reading the stars. Which is obviously a very scientific method, etc. But every time a patient is introduced, they have a little, like, almost a Greek chorus, if you know the theatrical term, of madrigal singers that introduce the people. So let's see if this works. Oh, please work for me. So we're finishing up the previous case.
Mary Payne is frightened when she spies a looking glass, for 'tis a portal out through whence the gates of hell do blast. A deadly and foul wind that comes direct from Satan's mouth.
As you can see, a little bit of nonverbal divergence to maybe enhance the humor, but very much in the same exact style of madrigal music, directly connecting to video games, leading us to Baroque music.
All right, so now we're into the Baroque era, which begins from 1600 to 1750, which is actually when J.S. Bach died, actually. That's when they marked the end of the Baroque period. And these are just some pictures that are from Baroque era. The one on the top left is the Palace of Versailles, which is in France. That's actually an example of Baroque architecture. And we have these two paintings here. They're also an example of Baroque art. And notice how they're very, very dark color during the era. It's kind of a contrast to Renaissance art, right? You can move on. Right, oh, hold on. Oh, this is the instruments.
Yeah, Baroque instruments.
We're changing courses here again. We've already gone over most of these. I think we can.
We can describe them. Do we have pictures of these? No, we don't. Okay, cool. Let's run through these real quickly. So you have for Baroque instruments, you start to have what are keyboard instruments. We haven't had a lot of keyboard instruments to this point. Most things have been your lutes and your hurdy-gurdy and stuff like that. Are those the plucked string instruments that have mechanical aspects to them? But we introduced things like the harpsichord and the spinet, which are, well, you've worked with harpsichords quite a bit. Would you like to describe what a harpsichord is?
Like,
Oh, wait.
well,
Okay,
I
yeah,
love the way
no, I was gonna
their
describe the
actions.
what?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, basically a harpsichord is basically like the early version of a piano. So just quick information about how a piano works. So a piano is basically what we call a hammer action. So it would so the keys kind of act like a hammer that kind of hits like a metal string. So it kind of just whacked the string, almost like you're hitting a mallet with it. And the harpsichord, on the other hand, is what we call a pluck action. So when you hit the string, it actually plucks the string instead. So that's why it kind of tends to sound closer to a guitar in
Or a lute or
tone.
something like
Yeah,
that, yeah.
lute's better.
And the
actually.
interesting part about that, though, besides the fact that it is a plucked instrument, the mechanical action that is developed for the harpsichord doesn't allow for any variance in how hard you pluck that note. So when you press a key on the harpsichord, it will always sound the same, no matter if you slam the key as hard as you can or if you press it very delicately. When it breaks, when the action breaks, and the string is plucked, it will always be the same volume. You can do more elaborate things, like some harpsichords allow you to engage additional strings, so you can play more notes, basically, on the same note, which makes it louder, or less, which makes it softer. Moving a little bit further, you have instruments like the viola da gamba, the violin. We've already touched on the hurdy-gurdy, which has persisted into the Baroque. But the viola da gamba is basically, it basically means viola of the leg, because you would rest it on your leg, correct? Yes.
Pretty much,
right?
yeah.
Good.
I guess.
It's actually, the family is not like the violin, even though it served a lot of the same duties of the violin. And the family of instruments has evolved and really only exists in the upright bass. You can tell the difference between violin family instruments like the cello and viola, and viola instruments, or viola da gamba instruments, by the slope of the shoulders, if you will, of the instrument. But we have other fun things that really come into their own in the Baroque. Specifically, and we'll kind of jump over these other things, but specifically the organ. But first, I think we have a little bit of stuff on harpsichord. What do you have to say about this here?
This is a terrible graphic. I'm so sorry I didn't put this out in music.
It's a work
but
of spreadsheet art.
And I didn't realize there were so many people that were so familiar with music were going to be here. So, right, but this is just like paying attention to the harpsichord accompaniment. So there's so many different instances of how the harmonics and instruments work with the music of the time they were built for. So this is a really simple one, and this is also a great example of 2 versus 3 for a pianist, which is really difficult, or an organist. What happens is you have just like D, A, and the bass line D, A, and then up top you have A, F, A, F, A, A. I got it backwards, but no, I didn't know I got it right. With the black ones, A, F, A, F, A, F. But the harpsichord, another thing you do, you can pull a stop out, and not only do the harmonics, like the next octave, speak very clearly, just not the note you hit, but the octave above it, but you can actually pull a lever on a lot of harpsichords, and you have a set of strings that are an octave higher. And what will happen is you'll have crossovers into your left and your right hand. And so these fun little rhythms, like the A starts to be repeated in a little rhythm, and even the composer, I think, seems to play off of it. And so one of my points here is, we'll go back, is if you were to play this on the piano, like a modern instrument, the music's not going to come across as well. So we just do a little clip so we can hear that.
I keep clicking and it keeps going. Hang on a second. There we go. Third time's the charm.
You can come here, that's good enough. Yeah.
Just a little
So
bit.
if you ever see that piece or try to play it in, like on a synthesizer, try it with a piano and then with a harpsichord, and you'll realize there are a lot of other things dancing around. And so a lot of these early instruments did that. So one of the things I like to talk about is how these kind of darker sound instruments in our current period, maybe don't play some of the older music as well. Oh gosh, my spiel on the organs. So I'm going to go off the track a little bit here. So this is something I've been reading about recently in the history of the organ. This is the hydraulis, and it wasn't a bellows pumped organ. They actually used water to pump and pressurize the air. And what's really interesting is they hid it kind of purposefully. So people were like, how is the water making the sound? Well, the water's not going through the pipes. It's just pressurizing the air. And these were invented in the Greek times, and they went through the Roman times, and they were even one of the main instruments used in the Colosseum, so it's kind of like the origin of battle music. So I always have a fun time playing the battle music on the organs. You can go to the next one. And it's just such a complicated instrument. I like what you were saying earlier, John, about this is like kind of our attempt at synthesizers before the digital age. So you have these really simple organs from Greek and Roman times that really just made a sound on their own, which is kind of the organ sound that's unique right here, and it's, hopefully this will pick up. So it doesn't really sound like any other instrument, but you get all these different sounds out of them. So here's one that's supposed to sound like a flute, like a low sound, and if you make them really skinny, they end up sounding like string tone. And then an example of really wide pipes is, and then they have a stop here too, and this messes with the harmonic. So the sound has to go here, and then it hits and it has to come back down, so it's going to play a note of a pipe that would be twice its length. And then give an idea of a sub bass.
Don't hit my head.
So, yeah, and then I ran out of air. So that's
Hey,
why.
can I try this?
Yeah, this is why you have to have the bellows, because you run out of air. And another reason they work.
I can do it.
That's it.
I can do it. I can do it.
Yeah, you're a flautist.
Yes, I am.
I got it.
Yeah.
Fine, he can do it. Go.
Yeah. So it's important to note it that these types of pipes work on the exact same principle that this does for generating a tone. The air is forced through, and then there's a fipple that splits the air to
So
generate the pitch to vibrate.
Yeah, and it's kind of like we have limitations on early digital music and games and everything else, and you can't really mess with the sound very much. And the organ was that way too. You can't shape your embouchure like you could on the transverse flute, and you can't bow the string differently. Like the string pipe's always going to play the same way. So, and then also with the harmonic structures where you pull out some stops and they all play at the octave you expect, but you'll see in a later video that there's a bombard that's pitched like a triple double contrabass. The lowest pipe is 32 feet long, so it's an octave lower than the tuba. It's playing 15 hertz. So it's just, but let's see. On to the next one, it just gets even more complicated. But so yeah, and we went through some of these designs, and then that Final Fantasy IX piece that's with the recorders, one of these little organ stops that's not labeled is called the block flute, and it's really designed to sound just like the recorder. So now, oh god, this is the funny thing. I think we skipped to, what is it? Can we skip to 154 on that video?
Yeah.
So here's the famous opera scene from Final Fantasy VI.
What was that number you said? 154?
Yeah, 154.
Got it. Hang on a second here.
And this funny little vocal sound comes out. And yeah, and no words, just oh. Okay, and then we pause there. You get the idea of the sound. And then if you go to like a 440, I think about 440, then I love Sally. She comes in and sings. And then here's like a female's voice emulated. That's good enough. So now for these funny loop pipes. Here's something I've done sometimes I don't deny. So in kind of the French Romantic organs and theater organs, which are designed to accompany silent movies before we could get sound on the film, there was the vox humana pipe, which sounds like the human voice. So here's like the bass. And you always have a wind regulator on it that causes a vibrato. Yep. Yep. And then the altos. And that's my vibrato. And usually, every time you put this on, you really want to put the vibrato on.
Yeah, and so a lot of theater organs can actually vary the air pressure to provide a vibrato effect.
Yeah,
that you can just switch on and switch off.
it's also really nice because they don't hold tune very well, so you can get around that.
So yeah, if you make it,
These
just
particular pipes.
ask
really,
any string player if you get enough vibrato, you can cover up so many intonation problems. Don't tell them I said that.
Don't call them out like that.
Okay, and then I almost got in trouble one time tuning an organ because I demonstrated the Final Fantasy fanfare on these trumpets on shamads, and the pastor didn't know, but his son did. But he was like, "That was really cool." So, because the pastor asked, he's like, what kind of music plays on there? And the only thing I could think of was the Final Fantasy fanfare.
That's the logical choice.
Yeah. So, but here's like just to kind of demonstrate. This is the actual trumpet stop with a kind of similar tune.
Yeah, like we said, with this is the synthesizer of the Baroque world. So they're trying to emulate literally trumpets with this, brass instruments, your brass section, your trombones, your trumpets, and it sounds
And the ones that had flags too.
like
is
this.
crazy.
Yeah.
It's the melody up top, just a single note. Jeez.
Infinite. Oh shoot! No, I didn't mean to do that. I'm sorry, guys. I want to skip forward.
Long time no see. it's just, and then the next is just play the clip of the Final Fantasy fanfare. Not that we all haven't heard this 3 million times.
Seems about the same.
Yep. Without the drums, but yeah. So, and then, so a lot of this stuff is like, you know, when I love the fact that a lot of us are playing video game music on current instruments and other instruments. So, so one of the things we do is we have a lot of orchestral stuff. So this is, if you skip to like 1615, this is not video game music, but this gives an example of what the organ could do. I always think of Mother Brain right now. So he's playing 3 keyboards at once, dropping his thumb down, turn it up a little if you can. And then with the bass pedals right at the end, he emulates the timpani roll by just playing a whole bunch of notes in the pedal at once. And right at the end, the 32 from Lombard comes on. Yeah, we'll just let it go because it hits a chord and that's the timpani roll. And then the giant Lombard comes in. Resonance go on in the room for like 6 seconds. So unlike the woodwind player or a violinist or a pianist, you have a soundboard. The organ always needs a room, so that's a good example of an organ. It's one I helped build. That's why I'm saying that. But that instrument, I'll be doing a little recording of the Mother Brain battle, so I'm excited about that. I just got to memorize the chords. They're really difficult. So.
All right, so now to talk about some of the aspects of musicality that we find.
Hold on, we do have a question back there?
I was going to say, one thing about organ lecture, you want to experience the intensity of that, like right in your face. If you go to like Longwood Gardens up in Penn Square, Delaware, they have an Aeolian organ that is backed up out of a wall. It's like in a room a little bigger than this, backed up across this whole wall. And they, around the holidays, they have a guy in there doing concerts, and it's intense.
Yeah.
Let it go.
There's the Wanamaker organ up at the Macy's in Philadelphia too. That's played daily. That's a gigantic instrument, 3 times bigger than that one. Go ahead.
All right. So just to discuss some of the like musicality and expression aspects that you find in Baroque music. So one of the sort of the doctrines that you found in Baroque music was the doctrine of affection. So what this was that you know, believe it or not, composers in the Baroque era wanted to express a very wide range of emotions, not just, you know, being happy and being sad. They wanted to show, you know, leisure, somber, reminiscence, all of those sorts of things. You know, and from when you listen to Baroque music, you may think that, you know, it's very point A, point B, it's very linear, but believe it or not, there's actually quite a bit of improvisation that you find in Baroque music. So passaggi is one example of this. So passaggi is one of many terms that you're going to find in how you play Baroque music. It's basically where you're going to sort of fill in the blank, with that blank being something that you're going to, that you come up with in the music. So I guess one way I can demonstrate this, and hopefully I actually play it right. So, you know, if we take a tune that we all know, I'll try to add a little something. You know, just adding little things in there like that, and you can do more things like trills and a couple other things that I'm going to discuss as well. So the fourth thing we have is a few ornaments.
Toss one quick thing in there. Another element of that passaggi idea shows up very prominently in Baroque opera, which is one of the biggest art forms of the Baroque period. We kind of glossed over that here, but the opera becomes a huge thing, and there's a very common form in opera. In opera, you have what is called the recitative, which is basically where characters sing at each other without like real rhythm. So it might be, "Good evening today, welcome to MAGFest, only one day left." nice to have you. And there would be the orchestra do bum bum, and that's the end of that scene. And then we would sing what's called an aria, where the characters reflect upon how they feel in that moment, and nothing really evolves until the next recitative, when someone bursts in the door and says, "You have 10 minutes left, get on with it." And then we go on to another song about how we're panicked because we don't have time to finish this, because I talked a lot. But in those bits, what?
There's no one after you.
Yes, wonderful.
You're only limited by my willingness to stay awake.
Appreciate it. So what you have in Baroque opera is you have this recitative and aria pair. And the recitatives are basically an introduction to every song. And then you get through the recitative where character expresses grief about and rage about being imprisoned unjustly by their enemy. And then we get to the aria where they just sing about woe is me, what loathsome gods hath let this happen, my enemy has triumphed. And that's the whole song. And it will go for 4 minutes or 3 minutes. And the way this happens is primarily this very popular idea that's called the da capo aria form. And I should have made a slide for this. But the da capo aria form, the word da capo comes from the Italian word for the cap or the top. And basically what it is you have your aria starts and you progress until you hit a certain point, and then you go back to the top again. And you go until you hit the end. And usually the end is like halfway through, and there's like a good final bit. So you have an A section, if you will, a B section, and then you repeat the A section again. And what happens in these sorts of Baroque arias is the second time through, you embellish what you've just sung. All right, and so you'll have that embellished version crop up the second time around with more ornaments. So if the first time through you sing da 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 da, the second time through when you come back it might be da 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 da. And you just throw some extra elements in there. I'm not doing it very well because I'm doing this off the top of my head, but they would do it off the top of their head, or they would figure it out and then they kind of practice it that way. And there are several very common, for every famous aria, there are several common things that you'll do the second time around for the da capo portion of it. But it's very much an improvisatory form to begin with. It's basically to show off what you do best. Then, I'm going to turn this back over. Sorry, brief digression into my favorite stuff. Ornaments. These are ornaments that would be used for that kind of thing. These would be things that you would have in your bag.
Yes. So some of these ornaments that you can use, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list. This is only one of a couple of many. So one is a mordant. So let's say I want to do a phrase like, I could do so you're kind of right there on the bottom. You can kind of see how a mordant would pass. So so then we have what's known as a turn. So one way I can do this is so basically I love how it sounds. You're sort of you're ascending and then you're going down and up, sort of like you're turning around. I like to think of it as like you're doing a U-turn on the highway, right? You're going back, not a fun thing, but a very fun thing that you can do when you play Baroque music. And then we'll continue. All right, so one unique aspect of trills in the Baroque era is that we're typically used to trills being like, instead, in the Baroque era, you're typically going to hear trills go. We're actually going to start from the previous note and then descend into the trill, right? So then another thing we have is what's known as an appoggiatura. I love that word. It's just something very fun to say. And basically with that's where we have a note that simply looks like a grace note, but really it's actually designating a more separate phrase like the one listed. So So instead of, you're going to go something like there.
And usually the appoggiatura would be something, instead of like a lower note to a higher note, bum, 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 or bum, bum, instead of bum, bum. It's an element that you might add to a note to decorate it. They're all ornaments attached to pre-existing figures. So that takes us to this fun little example here.
Oh yeah, so this is basically an example of Baroque music, and this is the Bach's first harpsichord concerto. So we're showing you this because there's actually video game music that is definitely inspired by this style of music.
Spoilers.
Yeah, yeah, more Castlevania.
Keyboard, the action is moving with the lower keyboard. There's a stop that engages that. It slaves the upper keyboard to the lower keyboard, and then two sets of strings are played in unison.
And that's called the coupler.
Such
Right.
a good piece.
And just some qualities you try to remember. So from the harpsichord concerto, all you just have to notice is that there's a harpsichord playing with some strings, and that is exactly what this music does.
In video games.
Really?
And actually, if you listen to the sample of the harpsichord here, it sounds like there's two sets of strings being played at the same time, also using, although it might be sampled here, a couple of Yeah, it's the perfect place to stop. So, counterpoint. So, counterpoint is basically the art of combining different melodic lines in musical composition. It's among the characteristic elements of Western musical practice. You start to get, it's basically back to when we talked about polyphony, when we're writing one line and then a separate melody. It's kind of the codification of that second melody supporting the first one. Bach was really someone that we look at a lot when we want to talk about counterpoint. You have a variety of different types of established forms for counterpoint. Things like the canon, which is where you have a simple, like repeated idea. So maybe if you think of the canon in D, all of you musicians probably shudder when I even say that, but where it has a simple line, bum, 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 and it repeats, and then you gradually add elements to it that play off of and complement that line. To rounds, you know, let's see here, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, merrily, 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 merrily. Exactly. And if you cascade them all over each other, you'll get an interesting thing, that they all complement each other very nicely while being the same piece of music. Rounds are incredibly popular back in the Renaissance.
There's way too much organ music that does that.
Wait.
Yes, the fugue.
It's true.
Bach really overdid it.
And we get to fugues, which we'll touch on in more detail. But fugue is a very specific flavor of what's called imitative counterpoint. So if you have imitative counterpoint, you might have a melody that is bum ba da 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 dum da 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 dum, and something else might echo it. Ba da 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 da. All right, things like that, where one line is picked up by another part of the orchestra, or another instrument, or ba da 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 da. And these interlocking parts might happen where they're one part very much imitating or echoing, even if it's not exact, another element. The fugue is a very codified version of that idea, and we'll get into that in a second. You've probably heard that word before. Free counterpoint is kind of where we're following specific rules that are set down for counterpoint, but we can do whatever we want. And then this wonderful last bullet point here, 8-bit music, question mark, question mark, question mark, which is a whole thing to kind of unwrap. And this kind of, the idea of counterpoint is to establish like a harmonic structure for a piece of music. If you have a melody and you want to write some kind of harmony for it, but say, for example, if you're running on an NES and you only have like 4 voices to play with, you need to do something interesting. And so what you get is in early music, in early video game music, you get a lot of stuff that is very, very contrapuntal, i.e. using a lot of counterpoint in nature, because we want to do a lot of harmonic lifting with only a few voices, all right? And so you get in a lot of early 8-bit music, you get a lot of actual legitimate counterpoint writing, even if sometimes it breaks the rules of it, to establish those things. So if you think back to your Marios and stuff like that, you will have a few voices that are homophonic, ba-da-ba-ba-da-bum-bum, but then you have your counterpoint doing bass stuff, you have a little bit of percussion, one voice devoted to that, and you have like a harmony voice moving in tandem with the melody. So it's very interesting how that Baroque sound especially affects your early video game music. Talking about fugues, though, we can get a little bit deeper into this. Now, do you want to talk about fugues, Greg? Was that
Yes. So, I have learned a lot about fugues basically at Towson University, especially in the last theory course I took. And it always fascinated me how, when we were talking about the contrapuntal nature of fugues, which is, as John described, where we basically have multiple voices sort of layering each other and responding to each other. It always fascinated me how, like, they sound sort of the same, but then when they're together, they're completely different. So we can go to the next. Talk about what makes up a fugue. So the first thing we have is the exposition, right? So I like to kind of break down this word and bring it as like, this is the exposure. This is where something is being exposed. It's showing you what is the main subject that we are introducing. And that is what's known as our primary theme. And then we have what can then be known as the counter subject. And then later on in the fugue, we have what's known as the development, which could include a counter subject or even a second theme. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one. And so here again, you can see the sort of what makes up a fugue. So I kind of wanted to give a little bit of an analogy to describe this. Who here has seen the original Pokemon anime? All right. Who here has seen, which is my favorite episode, the one where Meowth learns to talk? Yes. All right. So if you all remember, he was sort of in this like acting center or wherever, and the first girl said she sells seashells by the seashore. Now we're going to call that the subject, and then all the other women who were students, they responded to her and said she sells seashells by the seashore. There's our answer to the subject, and then Meowth goes she shma shmi shma shma whatever, right? He's trying to sound like them, but failing miserably at first. So he would be sort of our counter subject, where he's trying to do it, but it's still very different. And here we have an example of a fugue.
By Bach.
So you're going to hear that subject first.
What a shock.
If this...
I just want to add, for the 4 years I took organ lessons, this is the song where I decided to give up.
It's lovely. It's fantastic. And here is a slightly flawed fugue from maybe a slightly flawed Katamari.
It's still really good.
You can really see the individual subjects here. So, yep, there we go.
I don't know if Bach would approve, but it's pretty nice.
At least one of the many children would.
Maybe just PDQ.
Yeah.
That kind of brings us full circle a little bit here. Having moved from the Renaissance into the Baroque and talked about a lot of different styles and how that kind of affects video games of the past. So let's talk about the video games of the future. So we've already mentioned Andrea Boccadoro's score for Astrologaster, which is phenomenal. Highly recommend you check out the game. It's on iOS. I think it might be on Android. It's on PC, etc. But it's just wonderful music, and it's really funny. But I'm working on a game that is very similar in some ways. You heard a little of it when we came in, and it's a game called Ambition: A Minuet in Power, and it's set on the eve of the French Revolution, where you play this young woman who travels to Paris to meet her fiance, and he's fled the country because things are bad. And instead of fleeing the country, she decides to try to work her way to the top of the Paris power structure by hook or crook, by blackmail, by a million other crafty ways, and to kind of eventually, hopefully, come out on top when and if the revolution happens. And so because of the period, all of the score for this game is very much designed to feel as if it came out of that, basically one period later than we talked about here, but classical era with some elements of the Baroque. And I'm pulling out a lot of the same techniques and instrumentation that we talked about here. But there are other composers that have done similar things, and even more so, there are a lot of people that are reimagining music from classic games and putting a different spin on them. So if we look at something like this, which we've had a little taste of already. We've never
who
seen
that
this
guy
man
is.
before.
Hi.
We can take something that, in this case, we're kind of realizing what Uematsu maybe went for originally. Is it really loud? Sorry. By taking this very interesting, very, very Renaissance-sounding melody that was played by sampled recorders originally, and bringing it to live performance. Do we just get to the end?
Other snazzy ornamentations in there too. Playing it is great.
Oh yeah.
Let's see here.
Right around there.
Okay.
Stop it.
You can hear a little bit of that imitative counterpoint that we talked about, where you get one voice ascending and another voice echoing it in the background. All right? Some really, really neat stuff. Fantastic work.
Yeah.
It's really cool to reimagine game music in these different styles. And I've done a little bit of that myself with, who here has played Everybody's Gone to the Rapture? One person. It's absolutely gorgeous. This will probably mean nothing to you by playing it, but I'm going to play it anyway because I like it. This is me again. I don't know, recorders seem to be the go-to for like this era, but I wanted to give this a feel of something that escaped from the late Renaissance. And so we have recorders at the beginning, and then we have some vocal stuff here as well. Very much, this feels liturgical, so as we move through this recorder section, we get a solo voice, a cantor, if you will. Right about here.
How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever. How long wilt thou
Again, hearkening back to that plain chant that we heard way back at the beginning. And then the choir enters. With some of those moving parts that you get in classic philharmonic writing, etc. We'll stop there. But you get the idea. So taking historical instruments and historical vocal techniques to give a different light to video game music. And there's countless examples of this, but it's something that we think would be a lot of fun to encourage people who like to do remixes and that sort to consider maybe exploring in their work.
Yeah, and for instrument players, I mean, if you play the clarinet, try the chameau. If you play the oboe, try the shawm. And you can go even further back to Mideastern instruments, and one of my favorites is the duduk, which is the double reed from Armenia.
Oh,
and that was
actually.
highly featured in the Dalaran theme in World of Warcraft.
So actually,
Yeah,
I'm
it's a beautiful
plugging
instrument.
myself a little bit here. But so back to game music a little bit. I did a little game a little while ago called For the King, which has a lot of very early Renaissance, almost medieval sounding instruments in it. And I wanted to give you this feeling like you had a party of bards following you around at all times. And I didn't have some of the, like, I wanted drum horns and stuff like that, but I didn't have what I needed to do. And so I used that in a very similar kind of style in the background. It's a fantasy world, so you can get away with things. But hammered dulcimer and some of these lighter woodwinds, flutes, and recorders. And then, of course, some larger string stuff as well. But you know, taking historical sounds and bringing them to video games. So that kind of wraps things up. Like, we've come full circle. We've gone from the early beginnings of human music all the way through Baroque, and then tying that stuff into modern video games and vintage video games, and kind of give you a little bit of idea for what is potentially possible. This is a very open-ended conversation, but we want to open the floor up now for any questions that you might have. So we've got a microphone here that we can hand, possibly a microphone here that we can.
Some feedback issues with this mic, but
Let's see if it works. We have our first question right back here. Hang on a second. She'll bring the mic to you.
take it far away from other equipment.
Or, you know, you could
Check.
just... Yay, it works. Yay, okay. So could you raise your hand again, sir? Yeah. Fantastic. If you could be our wonderful mic runner. Thank you so much. Here you go.
Whoa, okay, cool. Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, isn't there a difference between the timelines of what constitutes the beginning and ending of the Baroque period in music versus in visual art?
There is. There's like some overlap that is like not quite consistent, but the periods, like, it's time, you know, and so things are kind of mushy and flexible, and you can look at stuff like in the early classical period and say this sounds very Baroque, and things that sound like from the Baroque that sound like they could be a little bit later, and the same kind of thing goes for art. I'm not an art expert, but I very much believe you are correct about that.
You'll find too in different kinds, like, you know, French music versus German music, that you'll find it's really similar to the way the language goes too.
Yeah.
So.
When you have a lot of people in a country, you know, in a country, they don't necessarily travel as much, and so you may go to a small town and they're still doing stuff that sounds like it's 100 years old, and you may then like go to a major city and it is cosmopolitan and cutting edge. You know, you have people. You know, taking something from a little later in history, you had Haydn's music being incredibly popular while he was just off there in the Esterhazy Palace, completely isolated from the rest of the world, and people were exporting his stuff and saying this is the cutting edge string quartets, etc. Amazing, and he was oblivious to this because you don't necessarily get around. People don't travel as much. Any other questions? Yes.
Oh, thank you. I study Renaissance dance, so when I'm listening to all the music, I'm trying not to get out of my seat and dance too much. I guess it's not really a question, but I wanted to just share in one of my favorite uses of music, Renaissance music in a historical context would be the Assassin's Creed movie, or I'm sorry, video game with Ezio. And there's, and what I really love about this, and I wanted to kind of bring it up, is from a dancer's perspective, they play the Saltarello tune in that video game, and then they also have everyone hopping around and doing the Saltarello. So I want to try to dive more in to see like some of the dances even in video games and how they correspond to some of the music. So I just wanted to thank you for presenting, and sorry I don't have a question, but
it gave me an idea. I'm like thinking of like some animazing games where you have dancers that do battle.
Yeah, I would really like to see more of that and dig more into that because there's a lot of history in that area too. So thank you very much for your information.
I think there's actually a boss I just realized in Dark Souls that the dancer that actually like everyone gets killed from really easily because she dances in yes, and she dances off tempo to the actual music. So
wow.
Yeah, they do that. They have like the improvisation element in some of the Renaissance dance, so it would be really interesting to see.
Oh, and she definitely improvises when she obliterates you with her spells.
Yes, it's great.
Yep.
Bioshock Infinite, I think there's one scene where there's like, I think it's a contra dance or some sort of.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh. Yes.
Just unrelated to my question, but as also a dancer that has been preparing a panel for this, we should talk. Okay. Okay, so my question's not really about video game music, but it's about the fugue. Again, right? Is that how you say it?
Fugue.
Yep.
Yes.
Fugue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Is a modern major general that like whole song a fugue?
No. It's what's called a patter song, which is a specific genre or subgenre of aria, if you will, that happens in like the classical to the romantic era of music history. But basically, it's a song that has a lot of words. That's all it means. A patter song is frequently like text over actual like musicality. So when you have, I am the very model of a modern major general, I have information, vegetable, animal, and mineral. I know the kings of and could the fights historical, from Marathon to Waterloo in order categorical.
With many triple facts about the square, the hypotenuse,
etc. It's not like there is some imitation, like when he gets to that part, with many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse, the choir comes in behind them with many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse, with many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse. And it's echoing them, but it's just a little bit of imitation before going back into the solo. And he's not really doing anything that is like one voice and another. The very nature of the fugue requires multiple voices to be independent of each other, kind of quoting the same ideas at the very like least level. And you see, the patter song is a different animal, basically. I could go on at length about that if you want.
yeah. And it's really demanding. You got to make all these different lines stand out. So it's demanding of an ensemble, or it's demanding of pipe organ design to have even the bass line has to be very distinct, which is usually very muddy.
Yeah, for fugues.
So yeah.
So does that answer that question?
Yep.
Fantastic. Question back there.
Is the patter song specifically a Gilbert and Sullivan thing, or is it not?
It kind of is. Like but there are a lot of Italian arias that that come before that you get a lot of fun things where you have a lot of words, and that's very what's the one that you always hear?
Fra queste contadine cameriere cittadine, con questa parola se marchesade principessa.
That's yeah.
Barbara Seville, yeah. That's
Yeah,
it.
Barbara Seville. There. I forget all the words. I'm sorry, and I don't know them. I don't know them. I don't know them, and it's done. Okay, cool. But yeah, like that's another good example. Like if you know which one I'm talking about from the Barbara Seville, there are a lot of other Italian-based. Italian and sometimes like French and stuff like that, where they have a lot of words and they get through very fast, and they're generally somewhat humorous. So like the catalog aria and stuff like that are also things where like we're gonna like go through a bunch of things quickly, but like when it really, you can kind of tell the things that end up being like that when it is, the text is this long and there are a million syllables, and performing it clearly is part of the challenge of the thing. But the thing we call a patter song is very much spun out of Gilbert and Sullivan. And you get that, like Modern Major General, you get that with my name is John Wellington Wells. I'm a dealer in magic and spells, in blessings and curses, and never filled purses, and prophecies, wishes, and knells, etc. From The Sorcerer, another one of these things where it is just like a very flowing musical line with a million words, and they're all little snarky little like rhyming couplets and jokes woven into this thing, and you blink and you miss them, and that's kind of the fun of the thing. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Where's Baroque from?
Where is Baroque from?
Is he German, French, just country?
Baroque is the period. So
Okay, I thought Baroque was a person.
you may think of Bach, right?
And to be honest, I don't know the etymology of Baroque.
Oh, well, it's okay. So there's the Baroque period in history. It's a name that we use to describe a specific period following the Renaissance. And like we said, that term, I think, I believe it's French originally, right?
It sounds French. Yeah, it does come from.
I
a
should look up
specific
the
word.
etymology of
Yeah.
it. But I believe it is. I believe it is French, but I could be wrong on that.
Related to ornamentation?
So like it is like it's a period of history, and it tends to have connotations that go across history. So Baroque is like a very ornate sort of thing. You get like Baroque architecture tends to be very ornamented. There tends to be a lot of filigree, a lot of high detail work in things. Baroque artwork tends to be very detailed again as well, photorealistic almost, like the late Renaissance and Baroque art is very, very, very realistic looking. There's a lot of emphasis on light and how light behaves when it hits people. And in music, the Baroque is, as we said, like full of ornamentation and intricate interlocking systems like fugues and imitative counterpoint and things like that. So, but it's very much a historical period. It implies these things, but I don't think it necessarily means, and I'm sure a simple Wikipedia search in 5 seconds would answer this question, and we can do that if you want.
Well, the thing is actually, it says a pearl of irregular shape, and I'm looking at that, and it's like initially that doesn't make sense, but
well, that's just the first definition given to us. But
well, I think even from that, if we look at the ornamentation that is in Baroque music, we can see that nothing is everything is sort of irregular because so much is dependent, I guess, upon
the art
player.
and architecture and everything too. So
Spanish.
That makes much more
okay.
sense.
Yeah.
I see.
So it wasn't a person, because that's the question. Was it actually a person?
No, not a person.
Yeah.
That pretty much answers it.
Yeah.
That makes more sense.
Prior to the 18th century, the French Baroque and I was right. The French
It was
Baroque,
okay.
but it comes originally from the Portuguese and Spanish terms. That's cool. There you go.
But never
Assuming
person,
Wikipedia
yeah.
is correct, which is usually something you should fact check. But in this case, it seems likely that it is correct. Any other questions? No? All right, then I would like to thank you all so much for coming to our panel.
Thank you.
For braving the 2 a.m. end time. Up here you can see our names, our faces. You can follow us. You can look up us on the internet and find out more about us. If you have any questions, you can ping us, and we'll be happy to answer them. Until then, have a wonderful last day of MAGFest. Please go get some sleep. You've been wonderful. Thank you very much.